to introduce our moderator and panelists for the next session, which will be on moderation and the infrastructure layer. So first we have Professor Christopher Busch from the University of Osnabrück, and he's also one of the contributors to our special issue. So great to have you here, Professor Busch. Thank you. Then we have Corynne McSherry from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, speaking here on the panel today, and Zakir Durumeric from the Stanford University School of Engineering, and apologies if I've mispronounced your name. And then our moderator is Courtney Radsch from the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are going to continue this conversation about content moderation and moderation more broadly, focusing on the infrastructure level. And I first want to discuss, or ask Christophe to discuss briefly the main points in his paper, where he discusses the idea of shifting content moderation down what's called the tech stack. And there are kind of different layers, but the idea that there are social content application layers, and then there are more infrastructure service provision, kind of what's called the infrastructure, the bones of the internet, or the way that the internet and digital services operate, and thinking about where content moderation should take place. And I think this discussion is particularly timely given, of course, what's happening in Ukraine. Right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw that a lot of social media platforms and other types of services, from payment processors to domain name service providers to cloud hosting services, withdrew their services from Russia. And I think that really prompted a lot of people to rethink and grapple with this question of where content moderation should take place, and just kind of where more broadly moderation and access and the ability to access certain services should take place, where sanctions might be put on to different types of services, the rights of different types of governments to be able to access services. And so we're going to delve into some of that. This isn't only about Ukraine, but I think it's really hard to ignore. And while we are certainly, a lot of people are thinking about what's happening on Twitter and Elon Musk and his latest tweets, I think that if we think about the importance of the actual debates that we're having today, there are some pretty fundamental precedents that are being set because of the response to the war in Ukraine, and realizing, I think, following the deplatforming of then President Trump, following the insurrection, following the deplatforming of right-wing Nazi websites in 2018, and as alluded to earlier, the shifting nature of platforms and various internet infrastructure providers in this ecosystem since the Arab Spring has been really profound. But before we delve into the debate, I want to invite Christophe first to tell us, what is the main nexus of the argument in your paper and your main takeaway?
Thank you so much for inviting me. The starting point of my paper is basically the observation that decisions about acceptable online content are not only made at user-facing platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. Content moderation, just as Courtney said, is also taking place deeper down the internet stack, at the so-called infrastructure layer, which is inhabited by web hosting providers, cloud storage services, content delivery networks, domain registrars, etc. And also payment processors like PayPal and Patreon are playing an increasingly important role as arbiters in the battle over illegal and harmful content. Of course, this can be criticized, and it is criticized, and probably rightly so. Some scholars like Jack Belkin argue that providers of infrastructure services should not engage in content moderation at all, and should rather remain content agnostic. In my paper, however, I accept the expansion of content moderation to the infrastructure layer as a social reality, and try to answer two questions. First, how does infrastructure moderation differ from content moderation at the application layer? And second, how could a regulatory framework for responsible infrastructure moderation look like? With these questions in mind, the first part of the paper explores the various contexts and shapes of content moderation at infrastructure layer. And one important difference that emerges here is that infrastructure moderation is usually not about individual items of content, a single tweet, a video on YouTube. It is rather about meaningful moderation practices, or the lack thereof, at higher levels in the content moderation stack. For example, if you look at Apple's App Store review guidelines, they require that apps with user-generated content or social networking services must comply with a set of minimum requirements for content moderation, including filtering, reporting, blocking mechanisms. So in a sense, Apple moderates how third-party apps shall moderate. Therefore, I characterize this as a sort of meta moderation or second-order moderation. And if you look at how web hosting providers like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure are engaging in content moderation, their decisions are rather opaque. They're made on an ad hoc basis, and they are far-reaching. Because actors at the infrastructure level usually only have a sledgehammer, not a scalpel, you might say. They decide about deplatforming entire platforms, which of course can cause considerable collateral damage to perfectly legal and unobjectionable content. I suggest I stop here and maybe talk about the second part of the paper later to engage in the discussion.
Perfect. You know me so well. One of the things that you talk about in your paper is this idea of the asymmetric regulation model and the principle of proportionality, as you said, the scalpel versus the sledgehammer. I think also it's relevant the fact that a lot of the infrastructure level providers do not have moderation staff or consulting services. That's not part of the services they provide, and so you can have an owner wake up one day and just decide that he was angry and deplatform a website, as we heard from the CEO of Cloudflare in 2018. Corynne, I want to ask you, you are with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We are in a lot of different initiatives with civil society and academia thinking about some of these issues. And I think specifically thinking about it from the perspective of marginalized and typically disenfranchised voices who are disadvantaged in a lot of times by moderation practices. And I want to ask you, so I think EFF's position is certainly that, and a lot of our digital rights spaces, that you really should keep moderation at the content level, at the application level, and not push it down to the infrastructure level. I think on the other hand, you see that there is this imbalance between the power of states and governments and wealthy individuals on these platforms, and it seems like this imbalance. And so I think a lot of people were happy when they saw that InfoWars and the Daily Stormer couldn't get their payment processors to process payments, but then we also saw that Wikipedia got deplatformed from payment processors. So again, like depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on. So what is your perspective and maybe EFF's perspective, and can you tell us why it's so problematic to have content moderation at the infrastructure level?
Let me count the ways.
Can you count them into the microphone?
Sorry. Yes. Okay. So there are so many reasons I could talk for a very long time, and I will not bore you with all of the reasons. I'll just pick a few. Is this on? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, first of all, I think we have to remind ourselves that content moderation at the platform level is fundamentally broken. It is a mess. Start to finish, we can all think, you've been following the space, many examples where platforms got it wrong. But at the platform level, at least with some platforms, there is some ability for to hold the platforms accountable. And there's some ability to demand transparency and at least challenge. There's notice and appeal mechanisms at some platforms. There's at least something. But if you start having things, well, it's already happening to some degree for sure, but I don't think the horse is entirely out of the barn yet. But if infrastructure providers, when they engage in content moderation, First of all, yes, they usually only have a hammer, they don't have a scalpel, so they will always be disproportionate. They will always be over-inclusive in terms of speech that they take down because they can't help it. It's just the nature of the beast. Secondly, the mechanisms for accountability it's not just that they're not there, I don't think they can be there because for a couple of reasons. First of all, users are often not going to know what's missing. So even if you give users lots of information, assuming that they were going to process all that information and review all those transparency reports or whatever, they won't know what they don't know. So as an example, if your friend sends you a link and says, check out this amazing protest that's happening next week, you should go. And then you click on that link and it doesn't work, it doesn't resolve. Well, you don't know why. And there could be at least 3 different service providers that made it difficult for you to access that website and access that information. And you just don't know. You won't know whether maybe the protest organizers took it down on their own, right? You have no idea and you don't have an ability to find out. So decisions are very opaque to users, and accountability begins with users actually knowing what's missing. And if that doesn't exist, right, they can't find out. Another thing that I don't see how we fix is, let's say I'm a user and I want to vote with my feet. I want to vote with my wallet and hold a company accountable by switching to somewhere else. Well, with respect to a lot of infrastructure providers, even if usually you won't have the ability to do it that way, or there's a lack of competition. So for example, if ISPs decide to take a more active role, deciding what content should or should not be online, in most of the United States, if your ISP cuts you off, you have nowhere to go, right? You don't have a choice. So that means 2 things, and I'll close here. One is that you can't vote with your wallet, even if you want to. I don't like my ISP, so I'm going to go to a different one because I don't like their moderation practices. By the way, I don't think we should call it moderation. I think we should call it intervention. It's a much more accurate term. They're not moderating. They're just, it's an on-off switch. Secondly, but also it gets back to when we say like a scalpel versus a hammer, depending on what infrastructure provider you're talking about, like that hammer coming down on you can be really serious. So if someone who happens to have the same account with you, like someone in your family does something the ISP doesn't approve of, you're all cut off. Okay? And we all know, after the past 2 years especially, how crucial internet access is. So those are some of the many reasons I have more.
Thank you. We will definitely get to more of those. And I also do want to invite the people watching on Zoom and in the room to, raise your hand. We do have a moderator here. If you want to get involved in the debate, I'm happy to take questions and comments throughout. I want this to be interactive. But before we do that, I want to get to Zakir and ask you, we're talking about some pretty major issues we talked about earlier, COVID-19 myths or disinformation. I think it's kind of one of the biggest things, but also, countering violent extremism and terrorism content, when ISIS was quite active in using the internet to recruit and promote its terrorism. So there are some pretty significant issues out there where, we might really want to address massive public health issues that are caused by the circulation of this content that, as Corynne said, the platforms, the social media platforms are pretty broken in terms of their moderation approaches. And you have written about how domain registrars, CDN providers, et cetera, have gotten involved in the misinformation issues and the deplatforming from payment processors. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you view infrastructure level intervention or moderation?
So one thing I think we have to be careful of is also lumping all infrastructure together. I think if you look at someone like Visa or MasterCard or PayPal, they play actually a very different role in this ecosystem than looking at many, I think what we consider more network infrastructure providers, which are actually, for the most part, quite fungible. Websites don't really care in some ways who their web hosting provider is. And so when a website like Daily Stormer is deplatformed from maybe a more mainstream platform, those sites tend to go offline for a bit, but they come back. They tend to come back on Eastern European kind of providers, oftentimes on Russian providers, maybe on niche providers that are willing to host this type of material, or in fact might be part of their business model to host this type of material. And so I think for one thing, we should kind of separate, we can't think of all the infrastructure providers like Twitter or like Facebook, where we're making a moderation practice is something that has an effect on everyone. In some cases, it's a question of what do you want your business practices to be? Do you want to support this type of content? Or if you say no, there might be dozens or hundreds of other providers out there. And I think historically, when we look at sites that haven't been platformed in the past, this isn't the first time this has come up. I think in the past, when we look at sites that have been deplatformed, they probably are so far to an extreme that we say, for the most part, we're okay with those sites being deplatformed, that we're okay deplatforming organizations that are distributing CSAM.
Can you say what the
child sexual abuse material, so child pornography, right? And these sites have been platformed in the past, and they have moved to these other kind of niche providers internationally. And again, these cases, these sites don't go away; they move. I think what's come up now is that what we're talking about is for misinformation. It's harder to find. It's much harder to moderate. It's not easy to draw these lines, and that's where we've seen very inconsistent practices from a lot of these providers. In the past, they've had these policies. We haven't really argued with them. Now, when it comes to misinformation, when it comes to, I think, material that's somewhere between the alt-right and the right, but may not be calling directly for violence, those policies have all of a sudden become very ambiguous. And that's where that debate has started to come up, when we've seen what I think feel like some arbitrary decisions from each of these companies, and almost a mob type of personality, where we see a large number of people being platforming one site, kind of lump on, but it's not really governed by well-defined policies, or in some cases, any policy. It's just a somewhat arbitrary decision that appears one day based on a post, or based on a news story, or based on public opinion.
So one of the issues this raises, and maybe just, I think there's a lot of people in here who come from, maybe don't know a lot of the background of some of these discussions in terms of the collateral damage that some of this content moderation has on, the populations that are not dominant, that are especially not English speaking, not US or Western Europe based. So I spent 7 years as the advocacy director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, where I was working with journalists around the world who were constantly getting impacted by platform moderation practices. And this, collateral damage, take the issue of Syria, for example. There were hundreds of thousands of videos of the Syrian war and potential war crimes that were removed from YouTube because they were identified as terrorism. And that had a huge impact. I mean, in Syria, you had so many reporters that were being murdered that you could no longer have foreign reporters going there, and you relied on citizen journalists. But then those citizen journalists got their content was effectively removed. So that has huge implications beyond just like that individual. It has collective, I think, implications for how we understand geopolitics, how policy makers make decisions. So Corynne, can you talk to us a little bit about, how these issues around the negative impacts of moderation, right? I think we've kind of focused on like the Nazi websites, the extremists, the terrorists. Okay, great, let's get them offline, the sexual abuse material, but there's always collateral damage. And so if we push moderation or intervention down the stack, what are the implications of that for these marginalized groups?
Great. So yeah, I mean, and the Syrian archive is a particularly horrific example, but there are many, many examples at the platform level where we have decisions that disproportionately impact the less powerful. So, Twitter's policies around the use of the term queer have not worked out well. Tumblr tried to take down everything related to sex, and that just, had, well, it's also silly ramifications. regulations, but also, and actually a pressure based on new laws in the United States on all platforms to take down material related to sex has disproportionately affected sex workers and actually put their lives at risk. Beyond our borders, we just see all kinds of inconsistent policies that over and over affect the less powerful. And the reason that's even more dangerous, the first thing I always do kind of think when I look at what the platforms do, I think infrastructure providers, why would you want to go down this path? Because it's not working out too well for even Facebook that has more money than God. What happens at the infrastructure layer, I think, when it's even more invisible to the users and where the relationship between a user and the actual provider is more and more distant, it really comes back to the problem of they are less likely to have any ability to correct, to engage with the company and make noise about what's happening again, and they may not even really see what's happening. The other thing that's related to that is that when you create intervention pathways, we know this from what's happened at the platform level, state actors, governments inevitably take advantage of those processes to help silence dissidents and critics. So, for example, Facebook has a content flagging mechanism that's supposed to be private actors, but it is hijacked by states all the time. State officials sort of will flag content, acting as just a regular ordinary person, and of course they are not. They're a state and they're trying to silence criticism. So that's just one example. But those are the two immediate concerns that I have, is that especially though you create the pathways, if you build it, they will come. And if states will take advantage of something that might be designed to address X problem, but the pathway has now been created and it will be weaponized to address anything that a state wants to silence.
We are going to get to that point in the next round of discussion, but I wanted to first talk about this idea of invisibility, and I think that Christophe, you acknowledge this, and your framework for responsible media moderation includes this idea of subsidiarity, transparency, and procedural safeguards. Can you walk us through that, and how does this approach help mitigate maybe some of the concerns about invisibility? And you also suggest a risk-based approach and risk mitigation. So how does that help address some of these concerns?
Sure. Again, I share the view of the other panelists that content moderation, or yes, intervention indeed, at the infrastructure level is more problematic than what we see at the application layer. But still, it's a social fact. It's happening. And I think it would be very difficult to, let's say, prohibit it, or let's say, hope that they simply stop doing it. There are several reasons why also infrastructure providers are doing it. Because they want to be good corporate citizens, because there is political, societal pressure. There are various reasons why they are doing this. So I think if we accept this as a not desirable but fact, it's necessary to provide a framework that mitigates the harm of infrastructure moderation. And I think that requires a principled approach. What the EU is doing at the moment is tinkering here and there a little bit in the DSA, and
the DSA?
DSA, the Digital Services Act, which is in the final stage of negotiations. Maybe next Friday we will see the political agreement. A more principled approach, as you say, could focus on three elements. Subsidiarity would be the first. So infrastructure moderation should be subsidiary to content moderation at the application layer. If measures to fight illegal or harmful content are taken at the application layer, action should not be taken at the infrastructure layer. Infrastructure providers usually bear no responsibility for individual content items at the upper layers, but they should care whether actors at the upper layers actually engage in meaningful content moderation. In this sense, they don't have content responsibility, but I would say they have system responsibility, that there is, let's say, responsible system of content moderation. And therefore, they should limit themselves to establishing minimum standards for content moderation at the higher layer. This is what I mean by subsidiarity. The second element would, of course, be transparency, probably the most important element, especially when it comes to visibility of what is happening. Today, infrastructure moderation takes place in opacity, even more opacity than what is happening at the application layer. The DSA will probably change this, at least for platforms that are active in the European market, and requires players like Cloudflare, for example, to publish annual reports on their moderation activities. And this might even have effects beyond Europe if you believe in the Brussels effect or something like this. And the final point, transparency is not enough. It is also necessary to ensure procedural safeguards for those affected by infrastructure moderation. And here I think it is necessary to be specific because it is at the infrastructure layer probably not sufficient to have ex-post complaint mechanisms because of the very deep and far-reaching effect of deep platforming platforms. So I would rather say we need ex-ante procedural safeguards, a sort of graduated response, a warning, a temporary blocking, and permanent blocking only as ultimate ratio. So a little bit different safeguards than on the application.
Thank you. And Zakir, you, I think, rightly mentioned that there are a diverse array of types of infrastructure providers, and there is more choice among some than others. So what about this idea of, should we be treating certain infrastructure providers where there are a limited number of options as, for example, public utilities or public goods that would therefore, similar to, say, certain telecoms or must carry provisions in the past, be subject to a different type of framework and responsibility to similar to the mail, right? You can't prevent ISIS from using the mail. You can't prevent unfortunately, child abuse material from going through the mail because you don't have any sort of view of that. So does this idea of some infrastructure providers should be treated as public utilities or a different framework, and if so, like which ones?
I'm not sure if I have a strong opinion that they should be.
Okay.
I think there certainly is a distinction. And I think where you can draw that is if you look at providers like Apple or Google or probably some of like the ad providers or some of the financial conduits. Those are the places where it really matters. It simply doesn't matter for the fungible kind of providers to the same degree because organizations move around actually on a somewhat regular basis just based on kind of market demand. Different providers are cheaper, different features emerge. The type of content that you want to support or maybe enable on your platform changes. And so I think in those areas, policies probably won't have as much meaning because we know that people do move on a regular basis. And when people are deplatformed there, they may go offline for a couple of weeks. But almost every case we've seen them come back. The only places where you've really seen, I think, platforming having a more long-term effect has been either these kind of closed ecosystems, something like the Apple App Store, something like the Android App Store, or payment processors. A lot of these sites we know are monetized through ads, through donations. We see them go offline when they're unable to essentially find that income. But I think just definitionally, right, those are the places where it will matter. And in other places, it has seemed to naturally take care of itself for the most part.
Corynne, would you be comfortable with that approach?
I'm sorry.
I mean, that say payment processors, for example, this idea that there are certain level, can we differentiate types of infrastructure providers, or is the position like all infrastructure off
Well,
limits?
I mean, of course, there's different kinds of infrastructure providers. And the decisions that they make are going to affect, content differently, just based on the, I mean, of course, that makes perfect sense. And the problem that I have is that at every layer of the stack, there's a combination of problems, and how serious they are does depend to some extent whether you're an ISP or a payment processor or a CDN. So I think for me, I think of it as, there's a bundle of factors in play at the infrastructure level. But all of them are, at least one of those factors is going to apply to every service provider. It's just a question of how serious it is and how dramatic the effect is. It also, payment processors and ISPs are particularly hard place of intervention. ISPs for obvious reasons, everyone needs internet access, and payment processors because that's how many people survive, including nonprofits like my own. And often what happens is when one payment processor takes you down, they all kind of end up doing it together, right? Visa doesn't act alone. You will have Visa and MasterCard. So I think it's fine to sort of call out those as being particularly difficult, but I think a lot of the concerns I have apply up and down the stack. It just, again, they just apply a little bit differently. And either way, what we've done is you start creating an expectation that if you provide any kind of internet service, you need to be in the content game, right? You need to be that sort of part of your job now. And while I do realize, of course, this has been happening for a while, I mean, we had litigation when WikiLeaks was taken offline by Visa 12 years ago, back when we liked WikiLeaks. Sorry, we're still doing apologize for that. But when it was people felt a little bit differently about the organization. So it's not new, but it's still true. And this is why I don't think the horse has entirely left the barn. There are many service providers who are not engaging in this kind of interventions yet, and we're probably rather not.
Okay, so then I want to press you on this idea. Like, should we designate them as public utilities or common carriers or something else in order to provide that protection so that they don't have to start doing it? Are there levels of infrastructure that we should designate like that?
So, well, ISPs, I think, are common carriers already, and there's law about this that we've engaged in. To be a little bit careful because there's some litigation around that.
I think you should separate the server and client.
Yeah.
I think those are very different stories.
I'm sorry, say it again.
The hosting providers, so on the website side,
Right.
where you can change, you can move, are very different than a residential ISP where you can't simply find another provider. It's more of a censorship, I think. I think those probably have very different policies.
I think that's right, but I guess at this point, I'm talking about more like voluntary measures as opposed to regulations required in one way or another. And what I'm trying to advocate for is that at the moment, in much of the world, companies have the ability to make decisions about whether they're going to engage in this or not. And while I realize the DSA is moving right along, and so that may change in the EU very quickly, and of course, there's various kinds of legislation being proposed in the United States, which will then be litigated for years. But in much of the world, this is not yet decided. And I think providers in those areas need to have the ability and the flexibility to decide that they're not going to engage in content moderation. And one reason that we haven't mentioned yet for why they should do that, and why I think that's important, is what we really need, I think, more than anything, is a robust and resilient internet. And to have that, I want service providers focused on that, focused on providing those kinds of services that keep the internet strong and secure, not spending their money and their resources and their employers' time trying to figure out what content's offensive, what isn't, and how they should take it down. And that is, all across this.
On the other hand, you could argue that the diffusion and pervasiveness of disinformation, weaponized information operations, child sexual abuse material, terrorist content, hate speech, harassment, online violence actually is breaking the open internet in a way. And so could you look at this in a perspective where doing more at the infrastructure level could actually enhance the ability to have a more interoperable and open internet. And I think, Zakir, your work on, misinformation is really interesting because, it seems to show that there are a few key vectors of misinformation, which we've also seen, journalistic and academic reporting substantiate that there are a few key individuals and sites that are responsible for a vast majority of, say, COVID-19 disinformation. So, I mean, I don't know, is there a way to like reframe this and think about this as actually helping to promote a healthier and more open internet by getting rid of what amounts to spam? What do you think?
And I think this gets at the core of every moderation question. This is, I think, have anything to do with infrastructure. We could make the exact same argument about Twitter. What we actually know is that what tends to be on these websites that we're talking about are frankly extremes. This isn't how most people are stumbling upon misinformation. This is the alt-right in a lot of cases that we're kind of talking about. You can argue saying Twitter, Facebook, any of these places, would it be better if we moderate this content out? So I don't know if I necessarily see a distinction there. There's the whack-a-mole approach of content moderation on social media platforms, and yet we see it still proliferates. We see them rising up, they create new accounts, etc. So, for example, when there was research that showed when they deplatformed Alex Jones, not just on the social media, but the payment processing, the web hosting, the security service provision by Cloudflare, etc., that broke the network in a way that simply deplatforming from a social media site did not. And then that did affect the spread and proliferation of disinformation from that major vector. Yes, I think that's true. I think, again, what we know from that case is, again, it's monetization. It wasn't the infrastructure that caused that happened. It's the fact that they weren't able to run ads or pay payment to keep the site running. And so, again, I think it's a little bit divorced from the question of the website could continue to exist. It's a question of who's going to produce that content, who's going to be payment, more than would they be able to have a URL where that website could be hosted.
So yeah, Christoph, did you want to weigh in on this as well? Please.
React directly. Yes, I think also the EU is now applying this follow the money approach with a reform of a code of practice on disinformation, where they want to get financial service providers on board. That's right. But then again, there's still the alternative here, and that's cryptocurrencies. And we've seen this in many areas where providers of problematic content that have been financially deplatformed are moving into the cryptocurrency world, and regulation or let's say content moderation is somehow following them there, because some cryptocurrency exchanges like Coinbase then started acting as content moderators. So it's proliferating in all these areas. And another area which I think is really problematic, that is the emergence of what Evelyn Dweck has called content cartels. And we are seeing these content cartels not only at the application layer, we're seeing it also at the infrastructure layer, and even across various different types of infrastructures, technical infrastructures, financial infrastructures. The EU has suggested in its proposal for the revised code of practice to build up databases of misinformation-related ads, so that if an advertisement is banned on one platform, it does not reappear on another platform. And if you link this also with financial service providers, then you get a very powerful tool here, which should be handled very carefully.
Perfect segue, because there are some very powerful tools that have been created in the past few years that are creating a precedent for coordinated content moderation across the web and at various, I think, layers of the stack. So the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism, for example, which I'll refer to as the GIFCT, just trying to make sure everyone can, understand the acronyms. So the GIFCT and the, also you have the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, the GARM, which has created standards for tech platforms and advertisers that their advertising isn't showing up next to content that they don't like. And think about a dozen categories now. You've had a long time collaboration across platforms on CSAM, child sexual abuse material, on CSAM material, and coordinating that content offline. So, it does seem that we're evolving towards a coordinated approach to being able to do content moderation across the internet. And if you look at some of the GIFCT members, they are, like it includes Zoom, for example, it includes like Dropbox and, things that are not considered a lot of times within the content moderation debate. So in some respect, a question about the DSA is, why does it only talk about misinformation ads? Why not make all ads more transparent? And B, what are the implications of this more coordinated approach to content moderation? And maybe Christoph, if you want to address that first, because that is kind of, the direction that the DSA seems to be hinting at.
First of all, my understanding is that the DSA is aiming at transparency regarding advertising, not just with regard to misinformation, but in a broader sense. So that I think is a right approach here. Yeah.
Okay, but what about this idea of coordinating? We talked about, you mentioned like the coordination. We'll have a database so that all the platforms can remove it across their platforms. What are the implications of this? Is this the direction we want to be heading?
Here again, I think it very much depends on the type of content that you're looking at. There are the, let's say, easy cases. If there is cooperation between various actors on CSAM, fine. If there is a coordination on misinformation, a much vaguer concept, that's problematic, I would say.
I want to go to Zakir because I have a sense of what Corynne is going to say. So Zakir, what do you think about this coordinated approach?
I think one question would be, would it be effective at all at looking at infrastructure? The reality is that for most users, it doesn't matter where a website is served from. An EU user can access the website right now anywhere else that's not in the EU. And so I think we see is this content moving around. So I haven't seen necessarily this type of coordinated approach being used as much on the infrastructure side, or we haven't really necessarily seen it be as successful, I think, in the past when we look at malware and other types of expressional content. I think it is yet another kind of increase in friction, more than it is something that we'd expect to take everything offline. But in this case, friction can mean everything too. It's a notion of users being able to access content online.
But isn't there a coordinated list like spam? Isn't part of the way that spam is dealt with is through this coordinated approach? And we all like that. We all like not getting spam.
Yes and no. Definitely tech companies coordinate, and there, I think, and the infrastructure layer reputation is very important. If you're someone who's associated with sending tremendous amounts of spam, you're going to lose the ability to send email into Google, into Gmail, into Microsoft, into these other companies. And so it tends to be that a small number of players wield a tremendous amount of power because you can't access the majority of users online. And so you do tend to see some of these standards appear, but a lot of them are really driven, I think, by a couple of very large providers who set policies and others follow along with them. If everyone's going to follow Google's policy for whether your email is accepted by the single largest provider online, it's very easy to adopt that same policy. And so there certainly is coordination that occurs, but oftentimes it tends to be for the most egregious players organically. There certainly isn't any policy that says we share lists of who sent spam. What tends to happen is that technical communities emerge and they're driven by big players, and they share blacklists that say, we see the most spam coming from these addresses, from these networks, from these countries. Do as you will with that information, but we tend to converge to similar policies when that data is shared.
Thank you. Corinne, can you address this issue of kind of coordinated approach? And I also want to bring in this idea of pluralism as being a value in, I think, both human rights law as well as in freedom of expression and kind of press freedom norms. The idea that a more pluralistic information system will be a better system. It will be more resilient. It will allow more voices to take part. And so on the one hand, I think you see this increasing coordination to moderate many types of content, and like the GIF CT, incorporating these companies at different layers of the stack. And you could envision, for example, a government, as you noted, once a capacity is created, you can then, that can then be mandated by a government for a different reason. So couldn't you see, for example, the EU saying, well, if we've got this database of terrorist material already, well, that should also be prevented from being, monetized and hosted and served and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's precisely. I mean, to some extent, that's already happening. There's lots of ways in which governments are deeply involved in the GIF CT, for example. And the concern that I have about that, one concern that I have about that is that it means the sort of question: who decides what is and is not offensive? And a place where we've seen that play out in really complicated ways is around the definition of extremist content and what, and because different governments define that differently, and that has real effects on the kind of speech that's available. And I'll give you an example involving Zoom, where this was I guess a year and a half ago, Zoom and YouTube both decided that they would not host an academic conference sponsored by San Francisco State because the main speaker was a woman who had, to be clear, planted a bomb 20 years ago. So we're not talking about someone who's perfect in any way. That's not the point. The point is that she's been a political activist for 20 years and had a view to share about what's going on in Palestine. And Zoom said, we think we're not allowed to even host this. And so we're not going to allow you to have, and especially that meant we're not going to allow you to have this conference because this is in a time period when that was the only way to have an academic conference. This kind of meeting, it was not going to happen.
Sorry, not allowed to because of sanctions? Can you just clarify, why did they think they weren't allowed to?
So they interpret the United States sanctions regime to forbid hosting, basically providing this hosting service, providing this conferencing services could potentially get them in trouble because of the sanctions regime that we have in the United States. And there's actually there's reason to believe that they were interpreting and that was improper legal interpretation. But at any rate, the point is that they felt that they had to do this. YouTube followed suit. And so, that didn't happen. And that's the kind of thing where I think we should be very concerned because it means, here's an academic conversation that is happening. This woman is just going to give a speech. That is all we're talking about. But, someone has decided that this is potentially offensive content, and so we will not post it, will not share it in this really important way. And I just it seems to me so antithetical. The internet sort of makes so much possible. I realize that it's also accessible in many ways, especially at the platform level, but also the internet makes a million things possible, especially when you remember we're talking about the internet is not Facebook. The internet is not social media. The internet is your email. The internet is your conferencing service. The internet is your calling your daughter in Europe, which you can do really easily now. It's a million different services. That's the internet. And when we have interventions happening that we've seen fail so badly often at the social media level, but when we pressure providers of other kinds of internet services to also make content decisions, we're going to, the interference is going to be much, much deeper. And it keeps coming back to the question of, and then who decides? Who decides what interventions they should or should not make? And that is very scary to me, and I think it should be scary to you.
So, please.
Who decides, I think, is exactly the right question. And actually, at the infrastructure layer, I think it's even more complicated. Who decides? Take the example of the recent cooperation between PayPal and the Anti-Defamation. I think it's quite difficult to say to assess this, to evaluate this. Although
Could you tell everyone? I don't know that everyone knows about this cooperation. Could you just explain briefly what it is?
Recently, PayPal decided to cooperate with the Anti-Defamation League regarding their decisions on financial deplatforming and let's say engage in a conversation on what constitutes hate groups, because this is also a very vague term. And so on the one hand, you could say, well, maybe it's better if PayPal doesn't decide on their own what is a hate group and engage with civic society, or is it just ethics washing? Is it giving too much power to an NGO? So I think that's, is it a new type of a content cartel that is being forged here? It's really difficult to see if you ask the question, who decides? Is it better if PayPal decides it alone, or if they join forces? Really difficult.
And yeah, do you want to weigh in on this as well?
Yeah, I think one thing to note too is that there's also the question of, are they enabling this and at cost to them? So some of these sites or services are provided for free to all sites. So I think Cloudflare is probably one of the most prominent examples of this. But when they come under attack, there's actually real monetary costs to Cloudflare to keep those sites online. And so in some ways, there is actually a financial cost actually to the rest of Cloudflare's commercial customers to keep some of these other services online. So I think that's one aspect. And we've been talking about much more kind of on this regulation of these companies, but it's also this question of, should these companies have the expectation of keeping these websites online? And we've actually seen, really, I think, sad cases where we've actually seen major platforms be forced to deplatform journalists and other folks who come under attack because they've been under such financial pressure based on these attacks. So there's probably the most well-known case of this. There's security journalist Brian Krebs, who has constantly kind of dug into much of online crime that came under attack from many of these perpetrators online. And he was, at that time, his website was protected by Akamai. And Akamai said, essentially, this is causing such destruction to our network as a whole that we have no choice but to throw you off. And the only provider that was actually able to provide that service in the end was Google, that actually had the ability to withstand that attack. But it came down to, I believe, largely a monetary decision of where they're willing to continue to foot this bill for the entire publicly traded company to keep this one website online.
That's so interesting. I mean, Brian's work has been so important for protecting other journalists as well, and really uncovering some of the plots on the dark web, but we'll get into that here. I want to invite our audience online into the Zoom room and here in the room. Please go ahead.
So, great conversation. I sort of feel like we're conflating very, very different types of, I mean, it's a very different thing to say, for Zoom to say, our legal office department has said, we think we are at risk of violating sanctions law or whatever. It's very different to talk about child pornography and child sex abuse materials, criminal activities that, say, okay, so let's go with that. I think that's very different from the question of, who decides what's offensive, because, what laws we have now. We have procedures, we have institutions that decide things like, okay, would this actually be a violation of the sanctions laws or laws, so to speak? We have procedures, we have laws, we have institutions for that, for who decides. I think, but the transfer information we're seeing in the world with I think great difficulties is that we don't actually have the legal infrastructure to be responsive to that. So I think we need to be thinking about what are the new institutions that we would need to make these complaints. Think about the things that we are not talking about. We are not talking about, do we need a licensing regime? Right? Do we need a procedure where you have to actually, you have to produce a policy, you have to produce a procedure, you have to demonstrate your audit for whether or not you comply with it. Right? We're not talking about those kinds of institutions. At the same time, we're embedded in existing institutions. As all this is happening, we're embedded in a set of institutions that were created for the 20th century, where you could say, corporations can pursue profit, a corporate governance model is focused on shareholders, and we can regulate food safety, we can regulate misinformation, misleading advertising, fraud, antitrust. We create all that. And basically that was imbalanced. It's now completely out of whack. This is actually a comment from the first panel. It's not just India that lacks regulatory, there you are, regulatory capacity for this. Every single government in the world lacks regulatory capacity for this. So what are our new institutions? So point number one was, let's not conflate things that are already, we have institutions in law addressing that. And this totally new thing, one is how corporations, they can't decide. We're not going to associate with that set of ideas, that set of values, those sort of people.
I think that's so fascinating. And just a side note about sanctions, because there are these, I think that is fundamentally different to say that there is an inherent crime in sexual abuse material, and sanctions, there is a crime there if you do something that breaks those, but it's not even that clear, because if you remember, Facebook, Twitter, Google allowed the Taliban to have accounts on their platforms, despite the fact that they were on the terrorist sanctions list. So even when we get to sanctions, there's still this, individual company level decision about whether.
But there is a
right
process around that. If they are sued or investigated
right
or violated, then they have a legal process. They got courts. They've got all that stuff out there to address that question. That's not a gap.
So to the question about licensing regimes, there's a lot of discussion about, there's this default assumption that, everyone should be allowed access to all the services, and that is the default, right? But I think what you're kind of suggesting is, do we need a framework? Like, should you have to do a human rights impact assessment or a, corporate social responsibility type of get licensed before you can start a new social media platform or a new infrastructure level provider to show that you have the processes in place? So is that kind of what you're suggesting?
Yeah, and just to be clear, we've got a ton of that regulating all the rest of our
right.
safety systems, the building codes.
Right, you can't go start a baby food company without going through a bunch of hoops. Should we be able to start offering, infrastructure level services or platform level services? So let's go down the line and get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think that it is a key question of what new institutions, what new procedures, what do we need to address this? I will say, however, though, that if the United States government enacted any kind of regulation along the lines that I think we're talking about, we struck down under the First Amendment right away. We're not right away, after years of litigation. And it's just because the idea would be, the companies would say, you cannot force us to carry certain speech or not carry certain speech, unless you can overcome strict scrutiny. Now, I suppose a very high level of scrutiny. Now, potentially you could overcome that. We could craft a law that would pass First Amendment scrutiny, but I think it would be extremely difficult to do that as a regulatory matter. And the reason I raise that is not just to be like the House of No, but to rather point out, I do think that there's some important protections there, but I think there's another point to it, which is that the difficulty around creating new institutions is you're going to have very different jurisdictions that companies are going to operate in. The rules around speech in the EU are, of course, extremely different from the rules around speech in the United States, the rules around speech in Iran or Thailand. And so there's a really fundamental difficulty, it seems to me, that's kind of inherent to how the internet exists, that you're going to have jurisdictional clashes. And this is already happening at the platform level, and it's happening with infrastructure providers too, where they're trying to figure out which laws should I comply with? And which court orders do I need? And what if they're in conflict? How do I resolve that? So in the path towards trying to come up with new procedures and safeguards, I do think it's a valid thing to have a conversation about. Trying to figure out how we could do it in a way that's consistent, it's really, really challenging.
Talking about license regimes, you could say there is a licensing regime, and that's operated by the Apple App Store. In a sense, you can't get an app on an iPhone if it doesn't pass through the app review guidelines. And if the app review guidelines require you to have some sort of content moderation, that I'm not 100% serious here, but that's a sort of pre-market approval that you have to go through. And I think we're seeing similar things in other areas of the platform economy. For example, the Digital Services Act contains a rule on traceability of traders on online marketplaces, sort of know your business customer rule. If you want to sell as a third-party trader on the Amazon marketplace, Amazon has to verify that you are not a rogue trader in a certain sense. And these examples show, I think, that app stores, online marketplaces are not only market intermediaries, they are also regulatory intermediaries that somehow, let's say, help to implement regulatory requirements in these digital ecosystem. So maybe there's something to it.
Yeah, can I add to that? The list, banks have to validate the models, and they're now facing issues with more complex machine learning models. They have to validate that their models are effective for know your customer, for money laundering, for proceeds of terrorism, and so on. So that, and that's infrastructure, right? That's the way in which you protect the infrastructure of the banking system and the money system. So
Thank you. Did you want to come on now, Mr. Zakir? Okay, thank you. Please.
So this is about another way of looking at the infrastructure layer. Some of the countries have started something like an open network, wherein every stakeholder gets to know about the rules and regulations, and also transparency with respect to the originator of this particular trade or whatever it is, through APIs. So
through APIs, you said?
Through the application programming interface. So for example, India is conceptualizing something called as open network for digital commerce, wherein all the digital commerce companies will be there and it will be transferred, and they will not, we make sure that no one is discriminated because of the open nature of this particular network. So are there any comments on how we can incorporate the same thing with respect to content moderation or anything at the infrastructure?
Zakir, do you have a thought on that?
I think one thing that is really tough here again is just the international structure of the internet. I don't imagine any policy written like that countries are going to follow. And we, I think, see very disparate policies even now of just what content do different countries want to allow to be posted. Maybe you can imagine in a situation where it's controlled by one player like Google or Apple, they can decide to force a policy like this. But on the broader internet, change like that to me doesn't sound like something that's really possible.
Just going back just a second to the licensing regime. My question is that any different really than the issue of content moderation in general? Because these companies are still coming up with their policies around the verification process, right? I don't know how they're held accountable if they decide something that a greater public group or financial institutions would disagree with.
Christoph, do you want to address that?
Well, I think that's the inherent problem of, let's say, privately run licensing system that is run along the let's say the values incorporated in Apple and without democratic scrutiny. I think that very much relates to the very first panel. These virtual governments are not subject to scrutiny.
Oh, okay, but on the other hand, couldn't you say they are subject to some form of kind of like democratic scrutiny because people vote with their wallets or with their accounts or with their participation in a platform? So, you know, you have a pretty direct form of like democracy if you want to use that parallel, you know, from the first session in terms of these virtual governments. I mean, for the most part, you can decide like, okay, well, I don't want to, you know, use PayPal anymore because I don't like the fact that they're not deplatforming of, you know, whatever, or you can, you know, open an account or close an account on these different platforms, especially if we take the premise that Corynne offered that Facebook is not the internet, although in many countries, we know that it is the equivalent of the internet. So, I mean, isn't there some democracy in how, you know, people can, okay, who wants to take it?
I mean, I think it really depends. I mean, I think it's not such an infrastructure, we could say sure, but the reality is you can't exist without using Google or Apple, right? Do you want to have a phone? I mean, these actually aren't fungible as resources, and for the most part, I think we've seen that a lot of providers act in blocks. One will move first, but others will follow. And so I think in the cases that it may be most important, a lot of these companies still wield tremendous power.
Corynne, do you want to comment on this?
The other thing that I think is important here is that at the infrastructure layers, which of course they're different, they do different things, but depending on what you're talking about, users can't vote with their wallets because they have no idea that decisions even been made. They just don't have that ability to influence, unfortunately. And like that's kind of the key to the problem. It's the way in which these decisions can be so opaque to sort of ordinary people, and even companies and governments. I've had at EFF we have a legal intake line where people will reach out to us because they need some kind of legal help, and we regularly have people reach out and they're like, I've been cut off and I don't know why, and I can't figure out how to fix it, and I don't know what to do. And these are people who like realize that they've been affected in some way, but they still don't feel empowered to do anything about it or understand what has happened.
But is transparency really a solution? Because, you could think about, for example, the GDPR, which gave rise to all of, the cookies notices, which, I would call transparency theater, right?
Yeah.
It's not meaningful. And in a lot of cases, I mean, to Zakir's point is you have a constrained choice set, right? If you need to read that article for a paper you're writing or whatever, you're going to click yes.
Yeah, quickly to that, and then I'll pass the mic down. But I don't think transparency is the answer. And sometimes it's like it's a good starting place. But the thing is, with the infrastructure layer, I think in some respects, depending on what you're talking about, I think transparency is virtually impossible for one thing. But even if it is, like I have this sort of, so everyone will do a transparency report now. And then who's going to read all these transparency reports? I mean, I look at some of them because it's my whole job or too much of my job, but most people aren't going to do that, right? And I think it's sort of like the way we've sort of outsourced privacy to, and so in the United States anyway, we'll have a very elaborate, end user licensing agreement that everyone will then agree to and no one reads. And everyone knows no one reads it. And there's sort of, that's how we handle privacy in the United States. And it's very, very frustrating.
And even if you do read it, again, constrained choice set, what are you going to do? Christoph?
If I may very, very quickly jump in, I think these transparency reports are not even meant to be read by end users. If you look at one of the latest amendments to the DSA proposal, the European Parliament is suggesting to have the transparency reports in a standardized and machine-readable format that indicates it's not directed at an end user or consumer audience. It's directed at intermediaries who can process huge amounts of transparency reports automatically. Maybe also researchers who can work on this data. And then use their voice to raise a point to the broader public. So I think that's the model.
And I think one thing to add too is, some of these cases, some of these companies actually have policies that are public. Google has a policy about where advertisements can be used. Enforcement is an entirely different question. We still see that a political ads on them. And so I think it's also, we can write policies, but that also, even if we created all policies that we wanted, much of this space is moving too quickly for that necessarily to be meaningful for just the level where these platforms are operating at.
Absolutely.
Can I just
Yeah,
make
please.
one comment, which is when you're using the word democracy here, I mean, I think there's a distinction between a democracy of ecosystem partners and a democracy of users, right? So there's different levels, and certainly in a first tier, app store or licensing model, you're going to get some democracy of ecosystem partners who may or may not choose to go with you, but go with somebody else, right? They make a choice of where they're going to develop, are they going to develop that particular source versus, assuming there's not a right from anywhere kind of a model, right? So I think partners do have some level of say in the decisions around licensing regimes, because they can lead with their dollars. But I don't think that there's a larger level of democracy.
And I do want to again invite our Zoom folks to jump in, and just before I get to this next question on, just on transparency reporting, I think it also links to this idea, like the users, / citizens, people can't go read everything and like meaningfully consent to, they want to get on an airplane and know that it is safe. They want to buy their diamond ring and know that it wasn't a conflict mineral. And so just shameless plug, but working on a paper that I presented yesterday about, best practices in transparency reporting. One of them is to know the objective. And I think this is something that you were kind of saying, what is the point of a transparency report? What purpose is it serving? A lot of the times it's not aimed at a general population. That's actually really ineffective. It's aimed at specialists who then translate it into, for example, a certification that this diamond is not a conflict mineral. So you don't actually need to read the entire transparency report. So, and you have that online as well, right? You've got a lot of news integrity and trust initiatives that are aimed at saying like, this site is a trustworthy site. This is certified by NewsGuard or the Journalism Trust Initiative or other things. So you're seeing these types of, initiatives emerge. But yes, please go ahead and get a question back.
Yeah, to circle back to Web3, do you see this as a paradigm shift that potentially can improve some of the failings of the internet platforms currently? One example that's often thrown out is this notion of self-sovereignty and control over personal data. So you don't have to interact online with anything other than a wallet, so to speak. But I don't want to limit it to that. But how do you see Web3 as potentially changing the dynamics of these issues?
Christoph, why don't you start with that?
Well, of course, disintermediation in Web3 changes the let's say landscape. But then I think if you zoom in on how these decentralized distributed models function, I think you discover new intermediaries, smaller functional intermediaries, not the single platform operator, but think of wallet providers, as you say. Think of cryptocurrency exchanges. These are, let's say, there's a new ecosystem of smaller intermediaries that could also become choke points for free speech. So I think even in such a scenario, we might end up with similar models, but at a more, let's say, decentralized way.
Zakir, did you want to address that as well?
Yeah, I think most of the infrastructure providers we're talking about aren't going anywhere. You're still going to ISPs. You're still going to have some centralized way of getting to a website. There's going to be a naming scheme. I think that Web3 may affect more of the moderation within platforms. I think that we've seen as many platforms become more decentralized. It really depends on your definition of better. I think there are probably opportunities for some speech that doesn't happen on mainstream platforms, we've also seen rampant spread of misinformation on platforms and many of those groups migrating there. But I think at the infrastructure layer, infrastructure is not going anywhere.
So do you want to address that, Corinne?
I will just say one thing, but I'm not sure. I tend to agree that I don't know that it's an infrastructure question so much. I think the jury's really still out on what Web3 is and is not going to do. But the one thing I would flag, and this goes back to the question about people's just ability to make other choices. A lot of people stay on Facebook because that's where all their family and friends are, right? A lot of people think like similar things with other platforms. I think to the extent that we have, and I think this may be new regulations or just new practices that allow people to sort of take their data with them to new places and different places, to the extent that we have new interoperability requirements, that may loosen things up a little bit so that people really do have genuine alternatives at the platform level. I'm not sure how that plays out necessarily for infrastructure.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes left and oh, yes, did you want to?
Quick, so an awful lot of the discussion, I think could be sort of summarized as that we're sort of saying to new technology that it has to be backwards compatible with existing institutions and human capacities. The conversation, the note about like transparency policy being machine readable points in an interesting direction where we would say maybe the requirement should be to technologies have to have something like that so that I could come along and invent something that read those transparency policies and allowed for the citizen or state regulator to say, here are our priorities and standards. And when I encounter a new technology, a new platform, a new product, whatever it is, just read all of those transparency policies and tell me whether this one meets my preferences or not. And maybe I bargain with it. Maybe I say, you're not quite what I like, so I'd like a cheaper price, or just count me out. But I wonder if there's some potential there to say, let's stop trying to have the starting point be the limitations of our existing legal system and our existing cognitive apparatus.
Interesting. Christoph, do you want to address that?
I think that's a very important point, and it relates to another fascinating discussion, and that is about whether new technologies can make it possible to achieve a higher level of complexity and granularity also with regard to our institutions, with regard to our legal system. Let's say the current design of our institutions is based on limited availability of information and limited capacity to process this information. That's why we have typifications in the legal system and all these things. If technology helps us to overcome these limitations, then that could make it possible to let's say redesign some of the institutions. There's this debate on personalized law or granular law, which I think goes directly into this direction. Yeah.
Zakir?
And I think the counterpoint to this is that right now we're able to write much more nuanced policy, have much more nuanced discussions in English and law than we are in computer systems. Computer systems don't like ambiguity. They don't really like have any notion of nuance. They like to put things in buckets. They like things to have labels. And that's also, I think, inherently very dangerous, especially if we start to look at content from marginalized communities, from other communities that happen in silence, that we try to bucket and label all of that content in some way.
So I do want to get to, do you have a brief?
Yeah,
question on it?
because it doesn't necessarily need to be machine translated, because we we now can read a lot of that natural language. I probably invented machine learning that will read the privacy policies on the Android app and then go check to see whether or not they're violating them in terms of sort of specific things like using location information.
Thank you. In just the few minutes we have left, I do want to circle back to Russia and Ukraine, because we just spoke about, this idea of centralization of institutions. We have ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, who received a request from the Ministry of Information in Ukraine to essentially, take Russia off, take away their control of .ru and the Cyrillic domain name system. And there was I think a pushback by ICANN and a lot of people who were very concerned about that approach. But to this question of our institutions, are they fit for purpose going forward, and the precedents that have been set, especially I think in Europe, taking these approaches to blocking vast swaths of information, kicking, state media off of their airwaves, again, a denial of access to infrastructure. What do you think that this means for kind of the future of geopolitical warfare and how we're going to treat some of these questions going forward? Because I look at this and I think there are a lot of new boundaries have been broken. And I think a lot of people are thinking twice about, whether we should be doing more infrastructure level denial of access. So, just a little small question to end the panel with. And why don't we start with Zakir, since you have the mic?
I think it would be a very dangerous precedent if ICANN had decided to remove the RU. I think we also have to think about, to point to Trinity earlier, about what is the internet and how is this tied into everything that's happening within Russia. Also, that's being unrelated to the war. I think this gets at kind of part of the issue, though. This is, again, there's one naming system for the internet. There is no alternative. If this was a decision that was made, there isn't necessarily an appeal process, except for what ICANN may allow. They have full unilateral power in this situation.
Christoph?
I would also be very hesitant. Cutting Russia off the internet would in a certain sense, be the equivalent to the nuclear option, I would say, and it would hurt. I agree with Zakir. It would hurt also civil society. It would have enormous collateral damages, and I think that was the right decision not to do this.
That was 100% the right thing to do. But also, just as a practical matter, I'm actually not sure that what they wanted was possible. But even that aside, it seems to me that those kinds of actions often very much backfire. It seems to me that the last thing that we want right now is for people in Russia to be limited in terms of their access to accurate information. That is what the internet enables. The internet enables in many, many different ways for information to sort of get around the censors if people want it. And so cutting a country off from that sort of information just strikes me as just a terrible idea. And I understand governments acting under extreme duress. Everyone I'm sure has tremendous sympathy, but this particular idea was not a good one, and I commend ICANN for pushing back.
And I'll just add, I agree as well. I think, I wrote about how I was supportive of a lot of the platforms deplatforming the state media and state actors, but when it came to ICANN, kicking Russia off the internet has too many unintended consequences and really hurt alternative information sources. So with that, I want to thank everyone for a great conversation, really interesting debate. I want to, just because we ask questions or raise issues doesn't mean that's necessarily our perspective, but I think that we've really delved into some of the profound implications of infrastructure layer moderation and The complexity, I love this idea about thinking about what type of institutions we need going forward and how we make forward-looking policy instead of just kind of looking backward at the institutions and capacities that we have. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to our audience in the room, our audience online, and especially to our panelists.